Can British folk horror show a desire to return to the past? This is the question I will be attempting to answer. I will address two fundamental elements of the subgenre that showcase this desire, namely the setting and the motif of human sacrifice. I will be using two primary texts in my dissertation, Robin Hardy's The Wicker Man from 1973 and Ben Wheatley's 2011 film Kill List. The term folk horror is relatively new to film studies, and the lack of existing scholarship reflects this. Whilst there are broader overviews of British landscape on film, such as in British Rural Landscapes on Film, the research dedicated specifically to folk horror is scarce. Scoville has the most direct and thorough analysis of folk horror cinema, establishing an unholy trinity of the foundational texts made around a similar time, even though their productions were unconnected: Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. Scoville applies genre theory and identifies a definitional folk horror chain. All four elements of the folk horror chain complement and feed off each other, and are a useful tool to recognise the aesthetic and thematic canon of folk horror and its fundamentals. Newland and Young both align the image of the British rural landscape as a symbol of the past, as well as cutting communities off from the outside world and modernity. The isolation of the landscape keeps them within the safety of the familiar, and offers them protection from the potential dangers of future uncertainty. Paradoxically, the landscape functions to entrap characters in this isolation, as well as providing sanctuary to others, persuasively exploring why isolated communities will act in hostile and violent ways when these landscapes are under threat from invasive modernity and outside influence. Due to the relative freshness of folk horror in film studies, there is a notable amount of literature that surveys it, but little in-depth academic interrogation of specific texts, and little specific analysis outside of the functions of landscape. Scoville and the rest of the existing scholarship provide a useful critical framework through which to recognise and interpret folk horror films and their unique sense of place, but even Scoville gets sidetracked in his book, undermining his own argument about the intrinsic rurality of folk horror by arguing the existence of urban folk horror. Additionally, there is little to no academic interrogation of Kill List due to its relatively recent release, and none of the academic research convincingly outlines the uniquely British resonance of folk horror beyond just stating that this is the case. I will argue that the proximity of the rural and the urban within the shores of Britain is a significant factor to folk horror's British identity. As a creative response to this academic study into British folk horror's innate desire to return to the past, the disturbing division between urban and rural can be visualised through the context of the so-called Brexit referendum in 2016, where many British communities' decision to return the nation to a more insular and traditional form of governance clashed with the votes of many others who were happy with the more globalised and collaborative membership of the modern European Union. My study will suggest that this Brexit-era context is an appropriate time to further investigate isolated communities' disturbing sense of traditionalism and insularity on film that British folk horror has already explored through its depiction of landscape, but with the significant addition of contemporary contextual resonance. A socio-political boundary has been drawn between urban and rural communities, which is precisely what folk horror has the ability to present and literalise with chilling efficacy, also aligning it with a uniquely British context. From this, I will write my screenplay.
And now, for our more dreadful sacrifice.